I have a road trip story, but it's extra weird because it wasn't on a road trip that I even wanted to be on. At the time, myself and the girl that I was dating, well, we were going through a rough patch. And by that, I mean we were fighting all the time, even cheating on one another. Super toxic stuff, further amplified by the excessive alcohol consumption. I'm sure you get the picture. Well, after enough explosions and blow-ups, I finally decided to leave. My problem was, I didn't have any local spots to go to. Her and I had moved to the city and then broke up just 6 months in. I hadn't really made any friends or connections that were solid enough to let me sleep on their couch. That left me with one option after I made that decision, and that was to load all my shit up in the back of my hoopty and make that long haul back home. It was a 19-hour drive that I planned on splitting into 2 days. I've been driving for what felt like an eternity. The endless stretch of highway blurred into a never-ending nightmare for me. 8 hours in, and I started to feel like I was trapped in some kind of automotive purgatory. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting a sickly yellow glow over the desolate landscape. I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find a place to rest my head. Maybe splitting the drive had been a bad idea. I wasn't super familiar with any of the geography between home and the city that I was driving away from, which, if you're curious, was Nashville, but that's not really relevant to the story. It was the dead of night and I was teetering on being lost. The GPS had led me down a winding road, and trees closed in around me like sentinels. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that I was completely all alone out there. No cars had passed me in hours, and I hadn't seen a soul since I stopped for gas at that station a few miles back. The road was still paved, thankfully, but it was just a dinky 2-lane road with road signs every few miles. It felt almost way too rugged to be a main road, but at this point, I was kind of committed. Plus, for some reason, I had faith in the GPS flickering on my dashboard. As I continued to drive, though, the silence began to get to me. I turned on the radio, but all I could find was static and white noise. I tried to focus on the road itself, but my mind kept wandering back to the strange feeling that I was being watched. This was also probably due to the come down from my lack of drug use. My ex and I were definitely drunks, but since moving to Nashville, we started dabbling in what drugs we could find on Whiskey Row. Now that it was drying out of my system, I felt anxious and weird, a constant stream of sweat pouring out of my forehead. I'd only been on this trip for a few hours, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The miles blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and just complete boredom. I'd seen nothing but fields and forest for hours. I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find civilization ever again, which was important to me. My paranoia aside, I wasn't brave enough to just pull over and camp in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to camp somewhere with streetlights, like a park or Walmart in the next town that I passed through. As the darkness deepened, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. I was alone, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of the road. I pushed that thought aside and just focused on the GPS, willing it to lead me to a place of safety and comfort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A dilapidated sign announcing the next town was merely 30 miles ahead. The problem was, I'd gotten seriously exhausted at this point, like nodding off the wheel and almost rolling off the road, kind of exhausted. Because of the exhaustion, I was starting to get emotional. Part of me wanted to start crying, as more mind became more and more plagued with the thoughts of what I was actually doing, forced to retreat across the country because my girlfriend had left me. The devastation was getting a hold on me now. All I wanted to do was just get some goddamn sleep. I looked out the passenger window and saw exactly what I wanted to see. A small ring of rooftops way out in the forest. I was close enough at this point that the outlier communities were starting to pick up. I decided to run with it. There's no way I could make it behind the wheel another 30 miles. And people were people, so I decided to sleep there. I veered off the main road, my tires crunching on gravel as I made my way towards a small clearing. A lone tree stand loomed in the distance, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching out for the moon. The lonely sound of my engine's hum in the stillness. I was just happy to have a little moonlight, as well as some space away from the houses. The last thing that I wanted was to disturb one of the homeowners, have them calling the police or something. In fact, I turned off my headlights and drove purely by light of the moon. This way they wouldn't even see me coming up the road in my little sedan. I could pull off the road behind some grass or something, catch some rest until sunrise. As I pulled up to the tree stand, I noticed a small cabin slumped beside it, its windows vacant, the door hanging crookedly from the hinges that seemed to scream in protest. I shuddered, feeling a chill run down my spine. I stopped the car and just stared at it for a while. I wasn't expecting a building to be this close to the tree line, yet here it was. The longer that I looked, the more I could tell it was definitely abandoned. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just keep driving. But the thought of another hour on the road was too much to bear. I pulled up to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, and cut the engine. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of the unknown. My head was in the fog from all the bullshit that I was dealing with. Essentially homeless on the road, miserable, and now trying to find the safest way to sleep in the woods. I wasn't really prepared for this kind of outing, but it was just for one night, so I was gonna do the best that I could. I sat for a moment trying to gather up my courage. The cabin almost seemed to loom over me, as its empty windows stared at like cold dead eyes. I knew I had to get out, to stretch my legs and clear my head. But as I opened up the door and stepped out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something sinister. I'm sure it had to do with the creepy cabin that I chose to call home for the night. And yeah, I know, any sane person would have just slept in their car, but I'm a tall guy, 6'4". My car was packed to the gills with all of my stuff from Nashville. There was no way to spread out and relax with my height, so I had to sleep outside my car. Fortunately, I'd packed my little hammock, one I'd had for many years. One of the nylon pouch things that you can drape almost anywhere. I lashed it up to a tree up the hill from the cabin. That way I had a view of the area. Then started filling it out with my bedding and a battery pack, water bottle, all the random stuff that I might need throughout the night. I scarfed down a couple of PB&Js and did my best to just relax. Food did wonders for my nerves, as I remember literally shaking as I climbed up into the hammock. After licking my fingers clean and gaining the courage to turn off my flashlight, I accepted the darkness and enjoyed the twinkling stars up above me. As I settled in for the night, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, I started to hear these strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling throughout the trees, but then I heard it again, the sound of raccoons chattering and scuttling through the underbrush. We had them in droves back in the town that I lived in before. They'd come out of culverts and all kinds of weird places to get into trash cans, even come into people's houses through doggy doors. I grew up around them, so I didn't really feel any fear, more irritation that these raccoons probably were gonna bother me all night. I plugged in some headphones and did my best to just ignore them. The noise changed, however. I started hearing thumping around the inside of that cabin that I thought was abandoned. I was stricken with horror at the sound, but after a few breaths, I told myself it was more of those raccoons or just some other nocturnal animal banging around on the inside. I mean, it didn't have doors or windows. Literally anything could be inside there. Again, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing more tricks on me. But then, I saw her. An old woman, her face a topography of wrinkles, her eyes aglow with an otherworldly intensity. She limped up to one of the vacant windows and just stared out through the glassless portal. For a split second, I thought she was staring at me, but then I realized she was just staring down at the ground. Then she doubled over and disappeared in the cabin for a moment. When she returned, she was dragging a heavy bag through the doorway and across the rickety wooden deck, the sound echoing throughout the clearing like a death rattle. I was literally petrified. I couldn't have moved if my life depended on it. I hung there in my hammock, peeking over the nylon like a child as I swung between the trees. I was so glad that I hid my car and partially hid where I was sleeping. My subtleness was keeping me out of view. As I watched, completely transfixed, she scattered handfuls of dog food at a breakneck pace. The raccoons converged upon her, their eyes rolling around in the dark like little droplets of water. For every one raccoon that I saw, there were a dozen eyes around it, following it through the woodland. I tried to call out to warn her of the danger coming for her, but my voice was caught in my throat. Then they were everywhere. To my horror, I looked at the trees that my hammock was tied to. The raccoons were pouring down the trunks and over my straps in full stampede. Some of them even stopped to look over at me, curious the new decoration in the woods. They didn't look long though, just long enough to see that I didn't have any food, then continued to the bizarre gathering around that old woman's feet. The old woman's ritual was a twisted one, a dark midnight errand of a total weirdo. I say this because she wasn't overly nice to the animals. Sure, she was feeding them, but any raccoon that crawled too close to her feet was rapped on the head or kicked across the yard. She outright abused them as she fed them. It was the craziest shit that I could ever imagine. The raccoons seemed to be drawn to her though, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. As I watched completely frozen in horror, she began to speak. Her voice was low and husky. Her words were a maddening chant that seemed to draw the very life out of the air. It was total gibberish. Some of the words sounded English, but most of it sounded foreign. If it was a language at all, it sounded harsh. I want to say German, but I know a handful of German words, and none were even close to that. Maybe Russian, I don't know, but definitely wasn't anything that I could understand. The raccoons had zero reaction to her speaking, but by the cadence and tone, you'd think she was casting a spell or something. It was creepy as hell, and I regretted not driving into town immediately. Then I did the dumbest thing that I could do. For some stupid reason, I whistled over to this crazy old bat. Between encroaching on her property and literally spying on her abusing animals, I think my subconscious wanted to at least make an effort to let her know that I was there. That I was an accidental bystander and I just wanted to leave. She had no reaction to my whistle, as it wasn't super loud. Nope, not even the raccoons looked up from their dog food eating frenzy. I just continued to lay there, like the weirdest voyeur I could ever imagine. And then it was over. She hollered at the raccoons and started kicking and swatting at them, dragged the food back inside the house. The animals continued to crawl around the yard for a while, but the old woman vanished just as quickly as she appeared. After the bag slid back into the doorway of the cabin, it went silent again and I couldn't see her. After 20 minutes or so, even the raccoons started to peel off, slink back into their trees. This seemed like to be my time to escape, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't move. You might be catching a theme that I'm a huge coward, and you'd be correct. I laid there, told myself some stupid story about how I'd leave the second the sun came up, because there's no way in hell I was going to try to break down my meager camp in the dark. Not with some creepy ass lady a mere 40 feet away from me, doing God knows what inside the darkness of an abandoned cabin. Although I guess clearly it wasn't abandoned. She had to have lived there, as she had a massive bag of dog food that she kept inside. I imagined some crazy old hippie lady living off the grid and slowly losing her shit. Whatever the case, I was counting the minutes until sunrise. By my calculation, I had about 4 hours to kill. During that time, I just laid there. I think I fell asleep a few times. I welcomed it, but I jumped back awake every time, terrified that I was snoring or farting or doing something to give away my position to whoever might be lurking out there. I found it was the most comforting to just be awake and alert for whatever might be going down. I even set a timer for the moment that I'd pop up and start breaking stuff down, just before the few rays of sunlight would hit. That never came to fruition though. I woke up again, just as the first sparks of light were coming over the mountain. But that wasn't what woke me. It was that same dragging sound through the house. I looked and sure enough, the old woman was hauling the dog food back out onto the porch. The raccoons came scuttling out, now to a lighter forest. I could see that there were even more of them now. It sounded like something out of a movie, dozens and dozens converging on this strange old lady. She threw out handfuls as fast as she could, the shit out of the raccoons that got too close. This went on for the same amount of time, 15 minutes maybe, but the sunlight was killing me. It went from black to dawn relatively quickly, and I knew if she were outside for much longer, she would definitely see me in my hammock in the trees. Sure enough, as she was swatting the animals and speaking in that weird language, she suddenly stood upright and turned her whole body in the direction of my hammock. I froze, sunk into the nylon, and just did my best to pretend to be asleep. I had to look harmless, right? Then she did the creepiest thing ever. This old lady whistled that same tune back to me, the one that I whistled earlier. In the moment, I knew she did hear that whistle. She had likely been aware of my presence these last few hours and just hid inside the cabin. It took everything in me not to piss my pants or even throw up. The anxiety was boiling over into a massive panic attack now. Whatever problems I thought I had earlier quickly dissolved under the weight of that current situation. She did the same thing though, simply dragged the dog food back into the house and disappeared. Although this time I could make out portions of the inside. There was what looked like some kind of bedding on the floor, where she laid down and just went still. I wasted no time, truly frightened for my life at this point. Didn't bother with any kind of organization, just simply undid the straps and rolled everything up into that nylon hammock. From there, I ran as quietly as I could through the tree stand until I found my car, parked exactly where I left it, still locked thankfully and not messed with. I started to build a little confidence. I might actually live and get out of here. I threw my hammock and all my shit in the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and it wasn't long that I was rolling through the tree line and back toward the main road. The morning light illuminated something though. It wasn't just one little crappy cabin. They were all over, dotting the woody hillside. Smoke even drifted out of the chimneys of a couple of them. I could see candles flickering in some of the back windows. As I drove by the nearest cabin, the one that I slept by, I could see that old woman. She crawled out through the open back door and across the deck, howling at me like a dog. It was insane to watch, but I was glad that that was all she did. I continued to bump down my slow descent away from madness, and as I did, I cast long looks in the rearview mirror behind me. Eventually, I saw a trio of people walk up to the highest hill crests, backs to the rising sun as they looked down at me. They had that same disheveled kind of clothing, wild hair. They pointed at my car, but never chased me. I figured they were part of whatever commune that I accidentally disturbed. And that's what they had to be, right? Too creepy to be Amish. Too established to be homeless. Just gave off this weird cult vibe. And that's what I left it as in my memory. If you're ever driving northwest outside of Nashville, keep an eye out for the dog food raccoon cult. It was literally my first night ever stealth camping solo. I was 18 years old and had just left my home in south central Wisconsin with the goal of riding clockwise around Lake Michigan. As dusk approached, I found myself riding a gravel bike trail through the farm country, occasionally passing through some small towns. I start looking for a place to pitch my tent, unsure of what exactly that would really look like. I was on a bicycle, so my supplies were pretty meager, just enough to keep me going between towns. I had a very small solo tent, a tarp, some food and water for the night and morning, a flashlight, and just stuff like that, you know. There are lots of little communities that dot the area that I was traveling through, so I was able to re-up my supplies essentially twice a day. There wasn't any way to keep a cooler or anything with me, so I wasn't burdened with some of those like other riders that I came across. Some of the backpackers along the trail were carrying up to 60 pounds of crap on their back. As a first timer out there, I was kind of blown away by how everyone operated. Eventually, I found a candidate. To my left, the bike trail paralleled a small state highway, a little grass path that crossed the bike trail, and then to my right, it went into a bit of a clearing inside the trees. There were maybe 8 semi-truck trailers parked in the grassy clearing. The trailers themselves were overgrown with grass, They clearly hadn't been moved in years, but the paths between them were well maintained. I didn't really know what to make of that, but for some reason I was able to just give it a reason away. I figured maybe someone was working on the rig, so needed access to the cabs. And for whatever reason, I didn't think anything nefarious could be afoot. I found a spot where the trailers blocked me from view, just about in every direction, and began setting up my camp. I didn't bother with my tent, just unrolled my sleeping bag and made a small fire pit to keep away the bugs while the sun quickly went down. I ate a very simple dinner, and I don't even remember exactly what that was. I just took in the surrounding area. It looked like maybe it'd been a field storage area for a construction company or something like that, but it not only just housed some old building materials, but blown out semis. There were trees that took up 100 feet off, and beyond those, I could actually see the flickering of lights of the next town. It was much closer than I realized, maybe only a mile or two. As the sun disappeared, I rolled out my electric lamps. Small but mighty, and they allowed me to enjoy the area just a bit longer. I knew once I turned those off, I'd pass out within a matter of minutes. It's the nature of being out on the road. There's something immensely human about being outside underneath the stars, and turning off the rest of the world when the sun goes down. I let the fire burn out, but didn't want to maintain it throughout the night. That way I could just ditch it in the morning. It fizzled into smoke after an hour. I was satisfied and ready to go to bed. Shortly after dark, I turned out my lights and laid down in bed. Now it's worth noting that this whole situation kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies, but in a bit of a fun way. Like I said, I knew the semis were weird, but I didn't feel threatened by them. The dark washed over my camp like a liquid, heavy, almost even suffocating to a point. I think some of it had to do with the towering semi-trailers around me, stretching up so high that they seemed to have just vanished into the night sky. I felt small down there, and impossibly alone. That wasn't my first night camping out, but it definitely was the first one where I started to miss home. Regrets and worries were starting to seep in, just as I started to teeter off to sleep. Just a few minutes after falling asleep, however, I heard something that completely changed the whole vibe. The squeaking of an old hinge, followed by a loud banging sound. I waited and then heard the footsteps, thudding down the cab ladder before padding under the mowed grass below. I can't express to you how panic-stricken I became. My arms and legs knotted up. My body refused to even take a breath. Every part of me wanted to scream bloody murder, but there was no way I could with my lungs being so empty. Thank God. The guy coughed and cleared his throat, then hawked the nastiest loogie I've ever heard. From there, he took a few more steps, at which point I could see him underneath the trailer. He was 2 semis over, so maybe 35 feet from me. He stopped, unzipped his pants, and started to take a leak. I could see a stream glistening in the moonlight, and after almost a minute, I watched this guy cover his own boots in piss. Right then, I felt sheer terror, like this person was deranged, totally psychotic. I know it's weird, but that little detail said all I needed to know about whoever this person really was. They walked around the edge of the trailer and wandered towards the woods outside of town. It clicked that this was a homeless guy or something, and now he was going to do whatever it was he needed to do at night in town. Beg for money, score drugs, get food, whatever his lifestyle was. I listened for a bit but didn't hear anything more. I realized it was now time to make my move. It really freaked me out though, and I decided it was enough. In the light of just my headlamp, I broke camp in record time, loaded up my bike and hit the trail. A mile or two down the road, I found a much better place to camp, though I didn't really end up sleeping that well that night. I rode until I was literally right outside of town, made a little stealth camp behind the first gas station that I saw on the outskirts. I think it was a Speedway. There were glowing lights from the parking lot, the road sign. I didn't get a lot of sleep, but I did feel safe. I never saw that guy again, and I'm glad he didn't discover me, although frankly, I have no idea how that was even possible. I wasn't being quiet when I made camp. I even had a fire and torch lamps glowing between the trailers. He had to have known that I was there. Perhaps he knew this sudden presence would be enough to scare me off. And if that was true, he would be correct. If somehow he didn't know I was there, My only conclusion is maybe he was just some kind of junkie, nodded off in the back of the semi. Whatever the case, I'm super grateful to have never actually met the guy. If you'll also indulge me, I have another story that comes to mind. A couple of years later, I set off on what would most likely end up being a 7-month, 5,300-mile tour on all the western US, mostly stealth camping along the way. One thing to keep in mind about traveling like this is that the forest makes far from a quiet night's sleep. Over the first few weeks of that trip, I'd come to find comfort in the droning of thousands of crickets and toads. Perhaps I'd camp near a babbling creek. It was always the highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes. I fondly recall one night where I camped right between two owls that hooted back and forth through much of the night. If nothing else, it wouldn't take much of a breeze to stir music from the tree canopy. About a month and a half into this trip, I was somewhere in the rural mountains of western Montana. For those that don't know Montana, parts of it are the most remote that you can get in the continental US. That wasn't the case on this night. I was hidden in some trees just outside of town again. After turning out my light and laying down in bed, I came to a disturbing realization. There was not even a single cricket chirping, nor toad croaking, certainly no coyotes or even owls. Even the dead air was still, with not the slightest breeze through the dry leaves of early autumn, still clinging to its trees. It was truly, completely silent. And that, to me, was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence that I've ever heard, and it felt as though the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. The occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony, and on this night, rang out like a gunshot, thoroughly crushing any half-sleepiness that I might have been feeling. And then there was this massive silhouette of a grizzly bear. It shambled up out of the meadow, puffing and scraping at the earth. The crazy part was, I was only a quarter-mile outside of town, and one of the few sounds that I could actually hear was the random traffic drifting by. The grizzly didn't give a shit about any of that though. Fortunately for me, it was still about 50 feet away, but even at that distance, the thing was enormous, rocking back and forth as it walked. It looked over at me, puffed a bit more, and then just continued on its merry way. I learned the next morning that that bear was a local nuisance, who made sure to amble into town and visit the local dumpsters a few times a week. When I rode into town the next morning, there was trash everywhere, people cleaning it up and bitching about the bear. I couldn't help but laugh. No wonder it didn't even bother with me. It had a full buffet just down the road. The locals themselves were actually scarier than the bear. Many of them had seen my little camp outside of town, so not so stealthy. They generally give me the cold shoulder and did their best to usher me onto the next town. Throughout the rest of that trip, I camped in sub-freezing temperatures. It made stealth camping in or near town an absolute necessity. If something bad happened to me and I found myself too far from help, there was no way I'd be able to navigate the distance and temperatures below freezing. The climate and scary encounters weren't the end of my troubles though. One night, I had a hostile bunkmate above me who talked in his sleep. The guy in the bed next to me loudly snored. This sounds pretty typical, but because it was a hostel, these dudes were both strangers to me and each other. I couldn't just shake one of them up and hope for the best. I had all kinds of images in my head of gently shaking one of them, only for him to attack me in his confusion or something like that. The guy above me would go from nonsense to some pretty cryptic shit, start saying a girl's name over and over and over again, then apologize, then a visceral depiction of violence. Some of the most eerie and weird stuff I've ever heard, like bashing your brains in with a mailbox post. Honestly, in that moment, I would have preferred the grizzly stomping around my camp again. The craziest part was in the morning when the guy woke. He was the most chipper dude you could imagine. You'd never even think he was the one talking through these hyper-violent nightmares. I actually stopped bunking with strangers after that specific experience. I've seen a lot of strange stuff on the outskirts of town, where I spent many nights not getting any sleep. I guess you can call me a thrill seeker, as I continue to practice this stuff to this day. I will never forget the autumn that terror came to our suburban community. It was the season of crisp air and vibrant colors, but also of unspeakable horror. I am a police officer. I've seen my fair share of crime scenes, but nothing could have prepared me for what we found behind that cluster of mom and pop shops. This happened to be the same year that my daughter won All-State as a pitcher for the softball team, but that memory takes the back seat, unfortunately. The victim was an older local resident, a familiar face in our tight-knit community. He was found lying in a pool of his own blood, his head battered beyond recognition. This guy was just a regular Joe around town, known for walking his dog in the morning and hanging out around the post office, that kind of thing. For someone to brutalize him in this manner was just insane, off the charts for our district. They even left the murder weapon, which was an old post for a mailbox. They picked it up and clobbered this fellow at least 30 times. The brutality of the crime scene was shocking, even for a seasoned vet like myself. The killer had this ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. Forensics and detectives were both scratching their heads, but us people on the beat had no clue where to even start. There were some cameras in the area, but nothing really helpful. One of them caught our victim entering the area behind the shops at around 6 in the morning, the normal time that he would walk. They didn't show anyone else coming or leaving the area until an employee arrived at around 8:30 a.m., which was when the body was discovered. Whoever killed this guy either never left the area or exited by some other mean. I remember some of the guys in the locker room saying that aliens did it. As the news of the murder spread, our community was rocked to its core. People were scared, and rightfully so. The thought of a murderer living among us, hiding in plain sight, was just unbearable. We worked tirelessly to find leads, but every avenue that we explored seemed to end in a dead end. The victim had no known enemies, no shady dealings, no apparent motive for the attack. It was as if the killer had just struck at random, leaving us with nothing to go on. Again, as a police officer, I've seen the worst of humanity, but this case was just different. The sheer brutality of the crime and the senseless violence, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And the fact that we had no leads, no suspects, it was almost like we were chasing a ghost. The days that followed were a blur of activity as we worked tirelessly to crack that case. We set up perimeters, questioned people in the area, scoured every inch of the crime scene for some kind of evidence, but nothing came to light. No leads, no suspect, no motive. It was as if the killer had just vanished into thin air. The cameras, the questions, none of it yielded any result. We were drowning within 72 hours, and the town council was starting to breathe down our necks. A failure to investigate would likely impact our budget for the next year, or at least that was the rumor. It felt like our lives were crashing down upon us. As the community grew restless, we grew more desperate. We started to investigate known troublemakers, hoping to find a connection, any connection to the crime. But every single lead ended in a dead end. The detectives and officers were working the case and getting spooked. We were all on edge, irritable, frustrated. It wasn't until we questioned this young punk kid named Alex that we got our first lead. He was a known troublemaker, always causing a ruckus in the neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember. When we pressed him about the murder, he'd said something that made our ears perk up. "It's probably the weirdo living in the walls," he said with a shrug. "The fuck did you say?" I asked him. I remember looking up from my notepad with a slack jaw. "We don't know who he is, but he lives in the walls downtown," he said again. What does that even mean?" "I don't know, man. He's like impossible to follow. We tried to mug him one night, but he lost us around the corner." "Where at?" "The same place that dude was killed, actually. Behind the breakfast spot," Alex explained. "Okay, so you're saying there's a man who can walk through walls in the area of our murder investigation," I clarified. It sounded like a lot of bullshit to me. "Yep," was all he said. "Well, what's he look like?" Suddenly, Alex lost interest and didn't want to talk as much, so my partner and I pressed him a little bit. did the good cop, bad cop routine. And it didn't take long before we had a full timeline, description, and hours in activity. It turned out this guy was apparently a bit of a celebrity to the local losers. He'd shown up downtown a month prior, seemingly at random, was definitely a drifter of some kind. He didn't ask for drugs or money or even alcohol, not even a place to stay. He seemed to have his own agenda going. And that's when some of the local kids decided they were going to kick his ass and see what was in his pockets. That was the same night that he vanished between those buildings, earning the nickname Wall Walker. He was seemingly homeless, had been seen rummaging through the trash cans and dumpsters. Looking back over the footage from the area, we actually had a couple of confirmations on similar people with similar behavior. We reoriented our investigation, focusing on finding this mysterious individual. This was a massive relief for not just the department, but every resident of our community. We set up surveillance near the murder scene, hoping to catch a glimpse of this mysterious stranger. Then just a few hours later, we got our first hit. A figure matching the description walked right into view. His gaunt face and matching clothes unmistakable. We quickly mobilized a team to follow him, but just as the kid told us about earlier, he seemed to vanish into thin air. We searched the area, but there was no sign of him absolutely anywhere. We knew he had to be here though. I could feel it in my gut. But also, this was what he was known for, right? So we just kept watching, kept waiting, hoping he would make another appearance. And then again, just as we were about to pack up, switch shifts with the incoming team, he showed up again, but this time, we were ready. He seemed to know every alleyway and side street, every hidden corner and secret spot. Yet despite his apparent familiarity with the area, he seemed to be walking in circles, as if he was waiting for someone or something. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, we lost sight of him once more. And this was the second or third time that he vanished, I guess? Well, here's the thing. He did it in the exact same area every time. There was a long building that contained two different businesses, and across from that was a large exterior walk-in cooler for the breakfast place, big locked steel container, and then the center block wall behind that, running the length of the alley. They converged to meet a second business in a separate building, just lots of little gaps and spaces. My team went down into this area, lit it up with all manner of flashlights, flipped the place upside down, and to our pleasure, we found that man. Behind the cooler unit, where the center block wall was, there was this small hole at the bottom. Just enough space for this guy to get through. On the rear side of that wall was a dumpster that looked to be locked, but actually wasn't. The pull bar was broken so anyone could open it. This explained that guy's disappearing act. As we continued to explore the lot, we found he had a full camp set up back there, tucked into some bushes on the other side. It seemed like he spent half his time hiding in the dumpster, the other half relaxing in the outdoor camp. After we arrested him, we would get the full story. His name was Roger, and he was recently displaced due to some other reason. My takeaway was general mental unwellness. Roger was smart though, like valedictorian smart, but also walked hand in hand with some mental illness or drug dependency, maybe even both. He was too smart for his own good. So after a few years of normal work life after college, Roger ended up going off the deep end and just wandered after that. The thing was, he was pretty resourceful due to his IQ. He did pretty well as he moved around the Midwest. What happened that morning was something else though. Roger had landed in town not by design, but by sheer randomness. He was hitchhiking. They decided they had enough of him in our downtown district. So from there, Roger moved in, tried to find whatever opportunities might be around. And as he lingered in the dark back alleys, he found that hole and that dumpster, and started building up his little decoy camp. He would use the secret pass to tail locals and try to pickpocket them, then disappear through that little hole he had, so long as they didn't see him go behind the cooling unit. The electrical box for the cooler did a superb job of covering up the two missing blocks. Roger had met our victim after living downtown for a week or two, but that morning something had happened. The victim had brought a scratcher ticket from a 24-hour gas station, and it turned out had won $5,000. He was walking around in complete disbelief, talking to himself out loud, waving the card around. That's when Roger approached him. The victim continued on about his good luck, wandering behind the restaurant to start his journey home. Roger's quick thinking had him snatch the post up and brain the victim, all so he could get his hands on that lottery ticket. We found it in his right front pocket, still yet to be redeemed, probably waiting for everything to cool down before he tried to get the cash. I went back to the scene of the murder the next day, and it was just unnerving to stand there right in the exact same spot as before. Look over and see the top of the dumpster from across that wall. Roger had been hiding in plain sight, what he called urban camping, for the entirety of the investigation. How many times had we walked circles around him in there, as he peered out of the gaps and rust holes, breathing and just waiting for us to move on? He'd been camped out back there for a month. We had no idea. I'm still with the department today, but I've never seen another case even close to that. I'm also thankful that it just took some crackerjack observation to break that case, and that it didn't turn out to be more nefarious. Roger is still serving time today, and will be for the foreseeable future.